I remember before I went digital or was just beginning that process, I remember the process that I had when inking my own stuff is I would lay out, after I light boxed it in light blue, the next step is I would go over with regular pencil and flesh out the figures with all of its anatomy. And then over the top of that, I would take a repeatograph and ink effectively the wireframe over the entire image, and then I would let that dry and then erase the entire page, leaving only the wireframe. And then on top of it, I would ink the rest of the way. It was kind of a slow process or whatever, and that's basically what has translated into how I'm working here. I found that working from a very clean but accurate structure drawing in ink and then applying your inks on top of that was what appealed to me the most. That is what inking over wireframes is. Inking over pencils, usually generally if you're doing digital inking, you're most likely inking over somebody else's pencils. So I discuss if you were to get a high-res scan or if you scanned it yourself, page of penciled art, and then inking over the top of it so that you're not just creating the line out of nowhere like you would with the wireframe, inking over wireframes. You are instead enhancing, clarifying, creating depth, just like a normal traditional inking would. But in working digital, you could try different textures. You're inking in a layer group above the pencils or above the wireframe. And I would sometimes try different rendering types. So like let's say if there was a piece of penciled art that had 5 or 6 feather lines in someone's neck or something, I might try that digitally, make a new layer, try to do a loose feathering. I don't know if that works or not. Turn off that layer, make a new layer, and instead create one really crisp quill line, or a line that you might get from a quill that has a really fat end and that tapers off into a thin end. And then you could even duplicate that exact same line all the way up his neck so that you have really crisp and exactly precise lines, or something in between. I mean, it just gives you a lot of different options in working digitally. As an inker, or if you are somebody who wants to ink digitally, you can create customized brushes that have different pressure sensitivity, smooth or rough finishes around the edges of the brush, and I discuss how to do that as well in Chapter 7.
When you were talking about inking pencils, you did digital inking over finished pencils, but also pencils with more rendering, showing that there's 2 different options as far as how you might have to work with it. Then you took it one step further as far as wrapping things up and preparing it for an editor, which I think anyone reading a guidebook wants to know, okay, I'm new to this process, haven't done it this way before. I know what I need to turn in. How do I get to that stage? Is it possible for me in this book to get a successful end product? And it is all right there, because I think sometimes guidebooks forget to put in that last step. It's actually the single most important step is at the end, what do I do with it then to get things professionally where I need them to be?
And that's the reason that I included it. And aside from that, I remember speaking to some of my editors about the perceived, kind of antiquated now, but the perceived prejudice against digital art whenever it first came around. I think it was Peter Tomasi who I was talking to that he said when it first came about, his only concern was, well, is it going to produce the artwork that I want, that I'm asking for? And if so, I don't really care. I don't really care how you get there. And so if you're using digital means, but it looks good and it's on time, I'm cool with that. So I just wanted to, throughout the book, talk about just realistic solutions that are coming from the vantage point of a professional comic book artist who understands what's needed. And that's one of the big ones. It was just then at the end of the chapter talking about completing the process, which is delivering a high-resolution TIFF that's usually in bitmap mode to the publisher or to a colorist, is also discussed in there. The traditional way to get this sort of artwork is to get a bitmap TIFF is most artists will have been instructed to, on their scanner, scan in a piece of artwork in what's called line art mode, I think it is. And it does an okay job, in my opinion, of it just scans in the artwork in either black or white. There's no shades of gray, and saves it as a TIFF file or as a bitmap TIFF. The disadvantage of that is when scanning something in line art mode, you don't have, as an artist or as the person who's scanning it, you don't have the versatility of adjusting what comes in as black or what comes in as white. What I mean is, as artists, anyone who's inked traditionally knows that sometimes the opacity of the ink that you're using is not as dark as some of the other pieces or parts of the inked drawing. So if an area is a little bit weak, So some of your render lines, maybe where after you erased over it, it kind of removes some of the ink, and so the inks look a little bit grayish. Those areas that you've worked on, you labored over, might actually disappear if you scan it just in line art mode. So I suggest instead that whether you're doing a fully digital inks or if you're scanning in the hybrid inks or whatever, that you scan it in RGB mode, actually, high resolution RGB. I then talk about how to eliminate whatever dirt that you have, and then go into how you manually change it to a bitmap and how you can do that in a controlled fashion so that you're paying attention to the line integrity, not the scanner. The scanner doesn't know any better, but you can go through and manually change settings. You could even potentially lasso certain areas. If that area I just described that's a little bit weaker with the inks, you could select that and treat it differently than the rest of the image. The rest of the image is very, opaque with its ink. Then you can have that with a different setting and then have the area that's a little weaker adjust the settings inside of that.
I got to be honest with you, in a lot of books, there's that last concluding chapter, which is kind of like the closing chapter. In a lot of the guidebooks I've read, I tend to skip that one. I got to tell you, I really liked this closing chapter, chapter 12, Looking Forward, because one of the things you did with this is show how you're very realistic about the nature of computers, technology, and software. The fact that Photoshop is going to keep making new versions, it makes sense that they would keep the palettes that are there as they add new features. But you also talk about how the sensibilities that are in this book can be adapted to the changing technologies as they come about. I really liked that because that's always going to be the case with any book. It's computers are like a car. The second you drive it off of the lot, it's out of date. And computers and software are the same way. But you're right in the sense that the sensibilities that are being presented here can be modified and applied as those technologies change, and also encouraging people to continue the revolution, to continue growing.
That's partially because even through the course of writing the book, things changed for me and my work process. I discussed briefly using 3D models in the very last chapter. Working in 3D can revolutionize, I think, how backgrounds and props and cars and stuff like that can be drawn in comic books. And so I briefly touch on that because even at the time that I was concluding the book, it was still early on in the procedure for me. Basically, I wanted to discuss creating comic books just in Photoshop and contained within that, and I didn't want to discuss a working procedure that maybe I wasn't comfortable with myself yet, and I didn't want to teach it from a point of only half knowledge anyway. So I briefly discussed that, and it is the spirit of it. The word spirit is maybe not one that's real common when talking about anything with computers, but it's the spirit of the user, of always being prepared to look beyond what you're currently comfortable with and currently using to what might be better, more interesting, a little faster, give you a different outcome. It keeps things fresh for you as an artist. It can keep the artwork from becoming stale. If you feel like as an artist you're not learning anything, and that goes for the artwork, for the digital process or anything, then your work will become very stale very quickly. So always keep yourself guessing and look for new stuff that's down the road. Don't be afraid to just experiment.